Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to BLITZKRIEG, our own strategic affairs show. There have been talks about how China is putting pressure on India. People are talking about salami slicing, how China wishes to take over Indian territory. But then, along comes Lieutenant General Syed Atta Hasnain with another point of view, which sets me thinking. I pick up the phone, I call him, I request him to come on the show, and he kindly agrees. Ladies and gentlemen, a very interesting topic today. I have with me as a special guest Lieutenant General Syed Atta Hasnain, former GOC 15 Corps and currently Chancellor, Kashmir University. Sir, a very warm welcome to our show, sir.
Thank you very much, Gaurav. Always a pleasure.
Sir, in a recent article for a prominent newspaper, you said that there is a sense of a hybrid war that China is trying to wage against India. You also mentioned Chinese lack of infantry on ground, and then you said that this entire posturing was essentially coercive in nature. They were not really prepared or not really ready for actual war fighting. And you also spoke about colluding with Pakistan, China and Pakistan joining hands. A very interesting mix of thoughts. My first question to you is, sir, why do you think what is going on in Ladakh right now is essentially a form of hybrid warfare?
Thank you, Gaurav. Firstly, let me explain to your viewers what is hybrid war. All wars, any form of conflicts, have a spectrum in which you have levels of warfare, domains of warfare. And he who chooses to go to war decides what levels he wants to adopt, which domains he wishes to adopt to his strategy. Based upon that, he establishes his various working plans. Now, in the case of the Chinese efforts which are going on against India, it seemed apparent that after a period of time, the Chinese did not have the force levels to fight what is called a conventional war, which is the higher level of war, the higher level of the spectrum. That they did not have the wherewithal to fight a campaign-style strategy by which they could go in for capture of large tracts of territory. For that, they needed a strength which was much higher, and as everyone recognizes, in the mountains and in high altitude in particular, you need ratios of 9:1 to be able to achieve anything. The Chinese had nothing of the sort. The Chinese versus the Indian deployment is virtually in balance, a mirror-like deployment done by India. So what were the Chinese actually looking for? I felt that besides the old strategy of salami slicing, of taking a little bit of territory here and there and sitting on it, the Chinese were responding in the environment which had two things going. Number one, the pandemic was on. And number two, there was an increasing in confidence of the state of India, of the Indian nation, by virtue of a series of actions which had taken place from 2016 till 2019 under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And therefore, this confidence was not something which was making China too happy. The Chinese wanted to make sure that in this particular state of things, they wanted to put India down, strategically dent its confidence, and send home a message that it was not anywhere near China in terms of comprehensive national power, and therefore it should pipe down. And looking for the new environment in the pandemic, the new geopolitical order which seems to be emerging, the Chinese wanted to make sure that the Indian confidence does not make them too ambitious. And that's the reason why they chose to do limited military action on the line of actual control with a series of other actions around India, which we can talk about separately.
Absolutely. So you make a very valid point about, infantry with artillery and missiles, the deployment being okay and fine as far as valleys are concerned and high altitude plains are concerned. But like you mentioned, the 9:1 ratio in MODEM, as we say in the mountains, you're saying that they did not essentially, while they brought their mechanized forces and while they had everything which 21st century warfare projects as a matter of force and as a matter of intent, they just didn't bring enough infantry to hold ground. Can your statement also be construed in that manner, sir?
Absolutely, Gaurav. I'm glad you've given me that cue to speak about. Because, yes, the Chinese came, they were carrying out a formation higher than a formation level exercise in the depth areas, for which they would have notified India well in time. It is this exercise that they converted into a kind of a coercive operation subsequently. Obviously, they were demonstrating to the world, projecting to the world a tremendous amount of technology, lots of missilery, artillery fire, etc. But shockingly, what was missing was infantry. And everyone knows that along the Himalayan front, you do have areas which are there for mechanized warfare. There are high altitude plains everywhere. And you also have enough scope for the use of artillery and missiles. But if you want to put territory under your boots, you need well-trained mountain infantry. And that the Chinese didn't seem to bring with them. Even the operations in Galwan, my sources tell me, were actually from the Chinese side, were fought by some kind of a mechanized element of theirs. So without this mountain infantry, without the kind of ratios, could they have actually gone for looking at tracts of territory? The fact that they did not even occupy the areas in Chushul, which were lying vacant at that particular time, because India was in a state of imbalance. Our troops had not fetched in, our reserves had not come in by that time. They could have, if they selected, they could have actually gone in for occupation of all these areas which they decided to start doing from the night of 29th of August. And India beat them to it. So that got me thinking, that why would the Chinese be so considerably unprofessional in their approach? Where actually my conclusion then emerged that the Chinese had no intention of capturing territory. And that their whole intent and aim, which is what we all need to be actually analyzing and trying to establish, there was something wrong in our assessment of their intent.
So what are the elements of hybrid warfare that China is currently using, sir, in Ladakh or even outside? What are all the, you mentioned in your article a lot of elements. You talked about economics and commerce, you spoke about diplomacy, you spoke about an entire spectrum of hybrid warfare and operations that China is employing currently against India. I would like you to explain to our viewers what these options are that China is currently employing against us, sir.
Gaurav, the response to that must start by quoting the oft-quoted Chinese strategy, the doctrine that they adopted in 2003. In fact, it was a takeoff from what they adopted in 1993, which is called the war under informationized conditions. And in 2003, they came out with the three warfare strategy, which is essentially media war, legal war, and cyber war. Now, if you really look at the definition of hybrid war, in which you pick out domains and levels of warfare, combine them to your requirement, you will see that China has always maintained a conventional force, very technically proficient conventional force with missilery, rocket forces, and everything. And along with it, all these three elements. So essentially, the basis of China's war fighting strategy is hybrid in nature. So they took a cue from that. They used the conventional side of it to a comparatively low level in terms of projection, in terms of actual fielding on ground. Combined with that, 2-3 domains that they have undertaken. Number one is information. This time we haven't seen it taking off in the manner in which it did during the Doklam crisis, but obviously they would be attempting to ratchet this up as time goes along. The second thing which they got into was cyber, and we are aware a lot of cyber activities taking place around us, and India has been, very proactive on that. The banning of the 59 apps in the beginning and subsequently many more other IT apps which were subsequently banned. And the icing on the cake actually, which should lead us to this deduction conclusion, is the fact that in four segments a major newspaper came out with this revelation that the Chinese are tracking almost every single important personality in India, every important institution in India, to look for pieces of information here and there which can be used as weapons of war fighting itself. So this was an eye-opener, absolutely. And particularly I related this to the fact that on the other side you have Pakistan, which gained a tremendous amount of experience doing this in Afghanistan in the 80s and decided to empower its Inter-Services Public Relations Agency, ISPR, to start doing the same thing against India. And it has gained a tremendous amount of proficiency in doing it. So with the Chinese ISPR combination, this is something which can turn deadly against India. With limited military projection on the borders, but all this to tie ourselves down in knots, our whole entire effort to reframe our foreign policy, reframe our economic policy, to come back from the pandemic, the situation of the pandemic. I think the Chinese probably realize this is a golden opportunity to do this. Dent our confidence while doing all this at the same time. And this is why I say that the military part of it in Ladakh is only a subset of the entire strategy which the Chinese are playing around us.
So I'll come back to this Pak-China relationship and the collusion that you've written so very well about, sir. Now, I take you to a certain line that you've written and something also that you've spoken about publicly about this entire Russian model in Ukraine. You compared the two models and you said that here is a Russian model in which Russia did such and China did such and such. Can you take our viewers through the Russian model? So what actually happened?
See, Gaurav, it's very clear that Russia has been under pressure of NATO ever since 1989. The ultimate goal of NATO would have been the dismemberment of the Russian Federation itself, perhaps. But the next best bet on the next strategy that they could actually go about with, as far as NATO was concerned, was to take the borders of Europe as close to Russia as possible, which means essentially the borders of NATO. And therefore, they were merrily into this business of bringing in many of the old Warsaw Pact countries, some of the republics which broke out from the Soviet Union, putting them under the NATO shadow or bringing them into the NATO fold and using them against Russia in terms of weakening Russia from the Western front. For Russia, it was a question of tolerance up to a level, up to a limit, and then a pushback, which was necessary, otherwise the Russians felt that they would get hemmed in completely. The pushback started in Ukraine in a very big way, with the attempts to try and change the government of Ukraine. You saw the up and down, the very dynamic process which went through in, I think it was in 2015, 14, 15, 16, that we saw this entire thing being acted out. The Russians realized also that this was not a place where they could just send in their army like they did in 1956 against Hungary or what they did in 1968 against Czechoslovakia. Here it was a question now of playing it slowly, playing it without going into any aspect of war fighting itself. So they chose the hybrid domain. And in hybrid domain, they went in to ensure that there was local uprisings, revolutionaries who were created and started acting against the state. The economy started getting meddled with. The factory workers, people in the streets, etc., were influenced. A tremendous amount of social media outreach was used. All these aspects of information warfare were used very, very effectively in Ukraine and continue to be used today. And with that, Russia has managed to control the movement of NATO towards its borders and probably perceive that it's got a much better control over Ukraine today. I am only looking at or perceiving the possibility that if anyone sitting in the National Defense University in Beijing is looking at models of hybrid warfare around the world, then you have to just Google, and the first thing which pops up is the hybrid warfare model of Ukraine. And if you study that deeply, you realize that the war-fighting angle is very, very limited in that. And so Chinese have probably adopted it for their use against India in their own way. Probably choosing Ladakh because Ladakh is the place where collusivity makes such a huge difference, collusion with Pakistan, and also because it tends to give a perception, because of the existence of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, it tends to give a perception as if China means full business in terms of its conventional capability to bring it against India.
So you mentioned border friction, intimidation, cyber threats, expansion of fronts, posturing, projection, psychological warfare, and modern-day information warfare. This in the backdrop of China-Pakistan collusion. How can Pakistan help China? You mentioned the China-Pakistan economic corridor because that is where it comes in from actually, sir. You know, that entire Gilgit-Baltistan area, that POK area, then it goes forward, sir. So it comes in from there. How can China-Pakistan collude and how are they actually colluding in the present scenario in Ladakh?
See, there are 2 or 3 angles to this. One is the aspect of physical deployment of troops and assisting China in terms of the war-fighting domain. Let's look at that first. As far as Ladakh is concerned, I consider Ladakh as 3 fronts. One is the Kargil front, which is totally facing the Pakistani side on the Gilgit-Baltistan side. The second is Eastern Ladakh, which is totally facing the Chinese. That's from Daulat Beg Oldi down to somewhere near Chumar. And then you have what is called the Central Tract. I call it the Central Tract. The Central Tract is the area, let's say, between Turtuk and Daulat Beg Oldi. Now, this is the area which very few people know enough about. They have not studied it enough. Not much is being spoken about today because all the action is essentially in eastern Ladakh today. What can happen in terms of physical assistance is Pakistan bringing some force levels towards Kargil and committing our troops in Kargil. Also trying to do certain intimidation, certain activation of the Siachen sector. Southern Glacier, Turtuk, Northern Glacier and areas like that, which to an extent can be like an assistance. It can be like a subsidiary operation for a main or a major operation coming from the Chinese side towards Daulat Beg Oldi from the Depsang Plains. That kind of a collusion will be very, very serious collusion, right? So if it comes to war fighting with large bodies of troops, etc., the Chinese may very well use the Depsang Plains approach towards Daulat Beg Oldi, ask Pakistan for assistance to the glacier area to keep India committed there, and look for the potential objectives, terminal objectives of actually entering the Nubra Shiok Valley and trying to take the tract of territory north of the Ladakh range. I do feel that this is a little far-fetched. This may be ultimately the ultimate aim of war fighting. But when it comes to low-level war fighting, when it comes to assistance as part of hybrid warfare, yes, Pakistan can definitely assist psychologically by placing troops in Gilgit-Baltistan and keeping, therefore, India glued to that side to an extent also, using a part of his forces or deploying a part of his forces towards the western flank. India's 15 Corps through Kashmir will also have to keep looking northwards towards that side instead of focusing his attention only westwards towards the area of Muzaffarabad, Kale and places like that. Besides that, Pakistanis have a very good idea of understanding of the Indian mind, while the Chinese keep studying it also. The collusive study of the Indian mind, of India's overall ideologies, of India's emerging strengths today, all this must have been studied strategically together by Pakistan and China. And that's a part of the collusive effort, I would say, the intellectual aspect of it. And then bringing all this into the domain of information warfare. At the moment, we haven't seen too much of it happening from Pakistan, particularly the social media being reasonably quiet in Jammu and Kashmir. But the scope for this exists in a huge way. And it's not alone Jammu and Kashmir. It can be many other domains within India. It can be all kinds of criminal syndicates in India, which can be influenced, financially influenced from Pakistan in different ways. So there is no limit to the aspects of hybrid warfare into which Pakistan can step into very easily. The biggest advantage that Pakistan has probably got is language. The commonality of language, Urdu, Hindi, Hindustani is a commonality, and therefore influencing through that medium, which the Chinese would find very difficult, is something which the Pakistanis can assist in. So I think you have to just start sitting down and making a list and imagining what can happen. And almost everything that you probably put down in that list you will find that can probably happen.
So you mentioned the Nepal factor, that anti-India sentiments in Nepal are being propped up by the Chinese. And we have seen KP Sharma Oli, the Prime Minister of Nepal, not condemning Chinese actions when China actually took over, I think, 1 or 2 villages of Nepal, nibbling away, salami slicing even Nepal that it claims to be friends with. And I'm not even talking about the Indian part, so let's stick to Nepal here. So this is what China is doing. What are your thoughts on that, sir? How far do you think KP Sharma Oli can actually sort of stop his political opponents? Because right from Prachanda to everybody else is questioning him, questioning his silence. And I've heard it from reliable sources that people on the street are dissatisfied over the constant and consistent interference of the Chinese embassy in Kathmandu. So they say that the government of Nepal is almost run from the Chinese embassy. What are your thoughts on this?
When I mentioned Nepal, I also in the same breath in this article mentioned Sri Lanka and I mentioned Maldives. I have not mentioned many other countries, but I go back to the famous string of pearls strategy. A lot of people don't agree with that, but I say that yes, as long as you are surrounded by these countries in which the Chinese footprint, somehow the influence is larger than the Indian influence, if that situation arises, then obviously the Chinese have got everything going for them. Economically, politically, socially, culturally. This is something that India has to work on much more. It has succeeded to a very great extent with what's happened in Maldives. It succeeded to a great extent in Sri Lanka, but it is still in that iffy kind of a situation where things could turn around at any time. Nepal, I'm convinced with what you say, Gaurav. With what you say about the situation in the streets and the perception of the people, I do strongly believe that our relationship with Nepal is very, very strong. Our military relationship with Nepal through the route of the Gurkha Rifles is extremely strong. And I think culturally, ideologically, in every field, the Chinese have attempted to do this, to put us at a degree of disadvantage and force us to take a step back, hoping that they can make a dent here. I don't think they've succeeded in doing it. This is only an instance where you find the Prime Minister of Nepal attempting to do things on his own, but then he has met with resistance. And I do think that India has woken up on time and diplomatically has made an outreach to Nepal. So I think we will overcome it. But the issue is that in hybrid war, these kind of things are pinpricks. It only assists. It helps you in diverting, it helps China in diverting attention. Now, if everything else, we should be looking at the Himalayan front. Nepal should be considered as a positive point in that entire graph, but suddenly it turned negative against us. And therefore, we were forced to start looking at it in a different way. That is one of the essentials in hybrid war, where you keep everyone guessing with small actions, comparatively innocuous things that you say and mention in the media, etc. All this makes a difference in terms of influence. So that is where the whole issue of China, Nepal, India has actually emerged in this. I suspect they will try attempting to do this with Bhutan one fine day. But probably the strength of India-Bhutan relations is very, very deep and will be able to withstand that completely.
Thank you very much for joining us, sir. It was such a pleasure and a privilege speaking with you. Ladies and gentlemen, my interaction with Lieutenant General Syed Atta Hasnain, he speaks about hybrid warfare in Ladakh. He speaks about collusion between Pakistan and China. And what the general says is that what you're seeing in Ladakh and what you're thinking of as a simple military confrontation is very, very different. There is more than meets the eye. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Blitzkrieg. I'll see you next week with another special guest. Till then, from my team and I, Jai Hind.